World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. Pardon me. Tape number or broadcast number 531, February the 7th, 1982. I've received several requests through the last year to do a broadcast on Fritz Kramer. And I keep promising I'll do that. And I've been outlining articles on Fritz Kramer, and I promise within the next couple of weeks, if the news stories, the other ones quiet down, I will do that. Fritz Kramer is the godfather of Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, and it's long overdue to do a story about him because of the influence that Alexander Haig is having in stirring up the war. He's over in Europe now trying to get the Human Rights Conference in Madrid to turn against Poland. He wants a blockade against Cuba. He wants a war in El Salvador. And Caspar Weinberger wants to arm and have munition plants in conjunction with Saudi Arabia. These people are determined to have war on every front. And because Fritz Kramer is the godfather of Kissinger and Haig, it's long overdue that we do a story. In the meantime, there's one article to start you off, you researchers who want to look it up. The Washington Post, March 2nd, 1975. It's from the New York Times, Nick Thimish. It's called The Iron Mentor, Why Even Henry Kissinger Needs Dr. Fritz Kramer. There are 2 points in this article I just might mention to whet your appetite. Fritz Kramer's mother lived in Nazi Germany during the war, and he went to school in England and in Switzerland and was in Italy. He had 2 degrees and then came to the United States to the Pentagon, where he handpicked Henry Kissinger to come back to Europe with him to the Battle of the Bulge and then help with the Nazification of Germany after the war. But during the war, his mother was living in Germany with Kramer's wife. She stayed in Germany. And her family is described in this particular article as being a very wealthy family. They got their money from the manufacture of paraffin and chemical dyes. Well, the only corporation that would be having chemical dyes, because the monopoly at that time and today is IG Farben. So that the money that Fritz Kramer had before he handpicked Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig was coming from the chemical dyes and the paraffin of IG Farben. The second point that is always dear to my heart is the fact that during the war, his mother had an estate in Nazi Germany where she had children described as Christian and Jewish. Well, I don't believe she had Jewish children in this home, but I know that after the war, people took Jewish names and Jewish identities and were sent out to Israel, to Palestine, Israel, the United States, Hong Kong, all over the world as having a Jewish background, and they could have come from this kind of a place that Fritz Kramer's mother had. They took Jewish names, and even Martin Bormann studied Zionism and Hebrew and understood the Palestine question and read Herzl. They knew very well the entire Palestine script, getting ready for a placement for the Jews, whoever survived after the war. So his mother had an estate where she had children, Christian and Jews, and I wonder just how many of those Jews were actually Jews but took those names. One of the researchers who listens to these broadcasts in Florida sent me a letter recently. He said, "You may remember Wolfgang Wick, a Nazi who was prospering in Israel when discovered in 1976. The Israeli government must have known about Wick. There must be Nazi money in Israel. After Eichmann, the Israeli government gave up hunting for Nazis. Jewish Nazis such as Begin have risen to power, accompanied by Arab Nazis such as Sadat and Nasser before him, who were members of the Muslim Brotherhood." As I said, there was an article in today's paper about Caspar Weinberger wanting to produce military weapons in the Arab world with Saudi Arabia. Just that's what we need, are arm factories in Saudi Arabia. There's a book review today in the San Francisco Chronicle, The Mystery of Raoul Wallenberg. Many of you have heard that name. It's called Mission Save Jews, His Fate Unknown. And soon I'll do a broadcast on Wallenberg. I believe that certain people were selected and he fingered them as Jews, and these were people trained to have Jewish names. I believe that he was spreading Nazis around the world at the end of the war, and he's being used now as a Cold War figure. And I can't believe that more than a handful of Jews, I don't believe there were 100,000 people that can come forward and say that he helped them escape. I only see one or two families, every time they mention his name. Well, Haig is traveling around the world peddling his war. And the important thing about Fritz Kramer is that he worked in the Pentagon. He started in the State Department right with the military. As soon as the war was over, he was an advisor to the military. And the important thing is he went to advise the chief of staffs in the Pentagon from the time of the National Security Council. He was with them when it was first formed, and he became their advisor. There was a recent today's article from Night News Service, also in the San Francisco Chronicle, aides bypassing Reagan on key policy decisions. In his first year in office, President Reagan has been almost totally uninvolved in foreign and defense policies. The president has not been in the administration's decision-making loop and has often not been allowed by his own White House staff to make decisions in these areas. The lack of involvement by Reagan is a primary reason why they shuffled around the national security machinery. It is one of the key factors in why Richard Allen had resigned last month. William Clark's mandate is to involve the president in foreign policy. Up till now, Mr. Meese or Alexander Haig or Caspar Weinberger have made the decisions. Meese has at times been quite candid about the president's lack of involvement in national security issues. Last December, he told an interviewer that the administration, at the Pentagon's suggestion, changed its nuclear strategy from a mutually assured destruction to one of assured survivability. They are relying on high technical advice without telling the President of the United States, and they are considering nuclear war. Now, this article tells about Haig and Caspar Weinberger making these decisions, and now they've decided they would bring Reagan face-to-face with his cabinet officials, so that the important matter of State Department war, Cuba, El Salvador, human rights, torture, whatever's going on in the world is not made by the President of the United States. It's made by outside officials, but I've never seen such a blatant article as this one going into that matter. Now, there are two articles this week that are dear to my heart, and I'm not going to dwell on them this evening. I'm going to get back to them later, but I just want to mention what they are, because one is out of Newsday. 76 people were indicted in Italy in a drug case. This has to do with Sicily, the mafia, and narcotics coming to the United States out of Sicily alone, $560 million a year. There's $1 million a day drug habit in Manhattan alone. But among those named in this suit for being involved in the Sicilian mafia drug operation are John Gambino from the United States, the notorious Gambino family of the mafia, and financier Michele Sindona. Now, Sindona was the treasurer of the Vatican. He was the one that went to Pope Paul VI, that took the investments of the Vatican property and put them into multinational corporations such as Pan Am, General Motors, Gulf Oil, built the Watergate Hotel. He put the Vatican money into American corporations and mixed it with organized crime and the crime syndicate. Sindona is now in jail for a $45 million swindle of the Franklin National Bank. He's also been charged in Italy for murder when he was over there on his fake kidnapping charge in between his sentencing for the bank swindle here. And now Sindona is named with his links to the mafia and organized crime. And as you know, I've done many, many weeks on the links of Sindona, the Vatican, and the crime figures. But another article along those lines that I got, this is another story from the New York Times this week. Ex-Treasury chief is sued. Now, this is another branch off the same tree of the Vatican, of the crime syndicate. This says the federal government, the Italian government, rather, filed suit yesterday in federal court in New York against former Treasury Secretary David Kennedy. David Kennedy was the Secretary of our Treasury under Richard Nixon's administration, and you know how clean that was. Kennedy has been charged with defrauding and bankrupting an Italian bank once owned by financier Michael Sindona. He helped defraud 1.6 million shares of Talcott National Corporation stock worth $27 million by illegally transferring this money around. Here is a man who worked with Michael Sindona out on a murder charge, swindling of $45 million, linked to the mafia, throwing drugs in the United States. And separately, David Kennedy, former Secretary of the Treasury under Crook Nixon, is being involved in another swindle of his own that is could almost match Watergate at $27 million. But the payoff is in the New York Times. It says a spokesman for Mr. Kennedy of Holiday, Utah, said he was out of the state and not available for comment. He is currently representative of the first presidency of the Mormon Church. Michael Sindona is linked to the Masons and the Grand Mason scandal, Licio Gelli undermining the Italian government with money going to fascists in Argentina and South America. So these two articles I'll go into at great length next week in much, much more detail, but I do want to tell you they're priceless because they just came out this week and they fit in with items that I've been alleging on this program for many years. And one more quick item I want to get to, or two more before I get into the rest of the evening. It's going to be on Air Florida, the part 3 of the discussion on Air Florida. Wall Street Journal has an article, Rising Media Mogul. His name is Holmes A. Court, a small a Court, Holmes A. Court. He's from Sydney, Australia. He buys theaters and plays and owns 51% of the independent television in Great Britain, film studios, film library, and he's very active in South Africa. He was born in South Africa. He attended a private school in Natal. He moved to New Zealand. He shuns publicity. He's a very wealthy man, Mr. Holmes A. Court. And this is the man who bought the rights to the music of Paul McCartney and the late John Lennon. Maybe you've read recently that Yoko Ono and Paul have been trying to buy back the rights to their songs that were sold. Well, they belong to this mysterious, wealthy man from South Africa and New Zealand who owns the rights to the Beatles songs. So if ever they close off or don't want that music out anymore, they can pull the songs off and tied them up forever. It's sort of like 1984. They're in the possession of Mr. Holmes A. Court. I never knew his name before, but he was written up in Wall Street Journal in a lot of detail, a large article this last week. Now, I did part 1 and 2 of the Air Florida flight, and I just want to summarize the past 2 weeks, my suspicions of this conspiracy of this flight going down. It's the first crash Air Florida has ever had. And I'll give you the summary on those, and then I'm going into an analysis of the super convoluted intrigues involved in this. And this will require you to take a pencil and write down some names. They may be new to you now and the intrigue, but I think it'll be interesting to you. And I want you to, I'm not going to rush through this one. I'm going to go slow because I want you to absorb the possibilities of intrigue or conspiracy when people want to affect a certain airline or take control of another airline. There are many reasons for sabotaging the plane, and I'm going into some convoluted politics of this particular Air Florida, as I say, part 3. In the last 2 weeks, I talked about possible motives for sabotaging the plane because it seemed evidence it was sabotage. The price war, it's the one successful airline going in the country with no debts. They ran an operation where they had reduced fares and they were filled all the time, as against Pan American Airlines, which is losing millions of dollars, and they pulled away Edward Acker in September from Air Florida to go work for Pan Am. There was a secret witness at the crash, always these secret witnesses with information about the wheels who doesn't appear later, but who sees it, that mysterious priest who's been written up since from the federal penitentiary who frequently attends disasters, who was at the Marriott Hotel. The filming of the crash exactly as it is done. Usually these haphazard accidents aren't documented with the filming so accurately. The ordering of silence, of identification of people that were drowning, or even the survivors, ordering the police and telling them not to get the names of certain persons. The questionable passenger list, the 7 employees from Fairchild. And Fairchild was, it's a large corporation, of course, aerospace, but Mr. Petri Loomis, who worked with Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple, used Fairchild as his cover for espionage work in Indonesia when he worked for the Nugan Hand Bank. So Fairchild is a very controversial firm with witnesses from the CIA who worked with Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple. and then the conflict of the Army and the Marines with the Rapid Deployment and Readiness Command Force. There were 7 of those people on this plane. The George Bush CIA connections to Jose Tirado, recently from Madrid, who was working at Bush's home. The mock plane crash that was simulated exactly 6 months before. The delay in getting assistance. The TV filming, allowing the TV cameras there before the rescue people were allowed in. The secrets about the flight recorder that they said we would never learn about. The way the media was covering the story, making the ICE the sole responsibility of the crash without properly getting the information from the recorder and so forth. The strange autopsies on the 74 people and the competition of these various government agencies. There were so many military and government people there. Well, the last 2 weeks I talked about some of the reasons and articles in the paper about the conspiracy. I'll run down a few more of those that came out since the flight recorder was examined, and some of it is still locked up. One, some of you might know, it was in the San Francisco Examiner this week, a Kennedy escapes death. Ted Kennedy was supposed to be on that flight, Ted Kennedy Jr. His mother said that the sister, Kara, drove slowly to the airport because of the ice, and he arrived late. And I did compare this crash to the one in San Diego a few weeks ago where Merv Dymally was supposed to be on that plane but drove down to California instead of taking the Sunday night plane when he was running for lieutenant governor against Mike Kerr. Another article this week, the San Francisco Chronicle and the Associated Press, the crew was not worried about the ice. Flight 90 checked for ice 12 minutes before the takeoff. Then this Chronicle article goes on to say 2 seconds after the Boeing 737 lifted off, 2 seconds. That's like, well, let's see. Now, this is, okay, that's 2 seconds right now that I stopped. 2 seconds after that, the voice recorder picked up the sound of stick shaker. Now, this is a device that warns a pilot that his plane is going to stall. 2 seconds on the runway, they got the stick shaker. And yet, 22 seconds after their climb, it plunged into the Potomac. 22 seconds. They were never higher than 337 feet before they plunged. And one of the pilots said, "Larry, we're going down." And the other said, "Wheaton, I know it." When I referred this article to somebody, they reminded me of Carl Oglesby's book, The Yankee and Cowboy War, that came out in 1976. And in that book, starting on page 254 and also in the appendix, he quotes the work of Sherman Skolnick, the researcher on Flight 553, and it mentions less than 12 seconds later when that Dorothy Hunt plane crash was going into Chicago at the height of the Watergate exposures when it was first coming out. The last message was United 553 executed a missed approach, come back in again, and 19 seconds later there was a crash. There was no future communication between the tower and the men. Unaccountably, the pilot requested a missed approach clearance from Midway. He was given permission to pull up. The stick shaker, the eeriest technical oddity about the crash of 553 is the behavior of the flight crew when the stick shaker went off. The stick shaker is a no uncertain terms warning device installed in the cockpit expressly to warn the flight crew the airplane is in danger of a stall. It is operated by the air data computer. It constantly is monitored and reflects upon the plane total flight state, including their speed, engine thrust, and their configuration. The positions of all movable surfaces, the wind and tail, the tabs, flaps, spoilers, are all told to them. When a stall happens at a high altitude, planes go into a spin. If it's a low altitude, it will crash tail first. But in the super safe Boeing 737, and the B-737 is the identical plane that went into the Potomac, there is absolute infallibility. The warning system has 2 parts. A noisemaker in the roof of the cockpit, the alarm, and also it shakes the hand, the flight control's hand, if pilot shakes. The commercial airlines say the stick shaker warning system is heard, it will be heard, but the feeling of it immediately warns them. The fact in the case of 553, that's the Dorothy Hunt plane crash, produced no apparent reaction whatsoever. It came on 22 seconds before the crash. Now, that's exactly what happened. The stick shaker, 2 seconds after the warning of the Air Florida plane, they got the warning, and it's heard on the tapes. And 22 seconds later, the Dorothy Hunt plane crash went down, and this other plane went down in the Potomac, the same kind of plane, and the same kind of a flaw in that the pilot just went on, and only this one in Washington was closer. They didn't even hardly take off. The stick shaker warning signal that was not evidently noted by the crew of 553 was not noted by the tower personnel either. And this book, The Watergate Plane Crash, the chapter, Watergate Plane Crash, the book, The Yankee and Cowboy War, goes into the identical problem that the Dorothy Hunt plane crash had, that the Florida flight had in Washington, D.C. Now, another article in the Washington Post, Tower Tapes said, I'm looking for a 737. Air Florida got a clearance to leave, but they were told by the men in the tower, you be ready for an immediate start because another plane is preparing to land on the same runway 2.5 miles away. And they got a warning, you've got to go. So they had no chance to solve. The stick shift, they were warned about the problem within 2 seconds out there. But they were told by the tower, you have to go. And they only had the plane 2.5 miles behind them was going to use the same space, and they had to be gone. And the same article from the Washington Post says that 61 seconds after the final message, the plane lost control and went out. And they called it Palm 90, are you there? And although the plane's whereabouts were unknown in the tower, the controllers cleared for another plane to take off. They had no record of this one, and they told the other one to take off. So evidently, if they're waiting on the runway, the ice and so forth wasn't the big factor. 1 mile north of the airport, the plane was already in the Potomac, and 74 of the 79 were dead. 7 minutes after the Air Florida left, an unintelligible voice was on the radio saying, are you calling me? Are you calling me? And the transcripts in the tower notified the authority then later of what happened. But this tower told them, you have to leave. And they had information that the plane was in trouble, and they left anyway. Jack Anderson has a story this week, Unprepared for Disaster. The investigators are trying to determine what caused the crash. And he says, I sent out my own investigators and found out that they were totally unprepared to cope with the disaster. There were no emergency plannings of this kind of takeoff since 1977. They ignored in those plannings any plane going into the Potomac. The tower had no telephone numbers or radio frequencies for harbor police. Well, all of that is a lie. I read on the air last week that they had a mock trial of a plane crashing in the Potomac on a bridge just like this. They had the rescue boats. They practiced with platoon boats. They had participants in July of 81 from the FBI, the Washington, D.C. Fire Department, the Army Helicopter Rescue Unit, the Police Department, and the Harbor Branch of the Police. They were trained in water rescue, mass water rescue. Why does Jack Anderson say this now? Because he's trying to make out that the problems came from being not prepared. That is not true, and Jack Anderson is not telling the truth. The Washington Post had 2 long stories on the mock plane crash and how they practiced the exact thing before it happened. The Washington Post had another story, and it was also in the San Jose Mercury, trying to blame the pilots for the crash. Again, this is trying to make them appear suicidal and wanting to die. It says, once in the air, the transcript indicates that they fought to get the jet's noise down and stabilize it. Investigators noted the pilots could have had a strong psychological incentive for taking off. They were behind schedules, and the runway was filled with planes. The tape recorder shows they were ordered to take off, and they also already had problem with the shift in the warning system. The plane was going to stall. Within 2 seconds, they had warning and didn't respond. Now, why didn't they respond? That's the area where you have to go into speculation. Were these guys programmed some way before they left Washington and got into the plane that when you take off, head for the Potomac, which is about not very many feet away, and go for the 14th Street Bridge? It seems that all the signals and warnings were telling them something was wrong, and yet they went right into this problem and didn't say anything on the tapes other than we're going in. They didn't have to get off the ground or have to go so high. So something led them to just continue. They were forced at one end to get off, and they had all the warnings on the system that come through the flight record that something was wrong immediately. And unless they were programmed to do this, and it goes back again to the book, The Control of Candy Jones, where she is told telephonically to take herself down to Paradise Island and dive into a particular place and commit suicide, leave her shoes and watch at the beach and commit suicide. The CIA has programmed people, and by telephone they pick up, they're told what to do. And it was Long John Neville who saved Candy Jones' life. And that's one reason it's so important to study the use of mind control by the CIA and Defense Department, because the only thing that makes sense out of this was that that plane went down straight towards the bridge and never had a chance, because it never had to get off at the time that it did. It had the warning within 2 seconds. One other article from the Associated Press, February the 5th, banter about ice in Air Florida cockpit. Conversations between the pilot and co-pilot reflect a confusion that the engine wasn't providing enough thrust. Alan Pettit said, "That doesn't sound right, does it?" "Oh, that's not right." And 12 seconds after that, the plane began to roll. One half minute later, in 30 seconds, they reached a position on the runway where they had no choice but to continue the flight. Well, who said they had no choice? I mean, they're pilots that want to live, and they have 78 people on there. Who is interpreting by the conversation that they have? One says it doesn't seem right. That's not right. And 12 seconds after that, the engine's rolling. They've already had a warning, which has come out through the sound system and to the control tower, and yet the control tower is saying, you have to leave. And so a half minute later, the aircraft reached a speed or position on the runway where the pilot had no choice and he had to continue. Well, I don't believe he had no choice. Unless they were programmed, they didn't have to die. I believe they were programmed, and that would be the only explanation, because of so many strange witnesses on the scene, so many controversial people on the scene. And now I'm going into the complicated half of this program on Air Florida, because I think it's interesting and it is complicated. And if you have a pencil, some of you might have a pencil handy, or when we take that 1 minute break in about 2 minutes, run and get a pencil if you don't have one. And maybe at the end of the half hour, I'll give you this diagram again. Start at the left-hand side of a corner and write Alaska International Airways up at the left-hand corner, and the name Neil Bergt, B-E-R-G-T. And then straight down, you can stop at Seattle, Washington with a stop, and then straight down to Los Angeles to Western Airlines on your left side of the paper. And then on the right side of your paper, we're straight across, put London, and this is important city in terms of money for Mr. Bergt, and then below that, Switzerland, and then below that, Libya. And just between Libya and Los Angeles, close to Libya, put Miami. Draw yourself a little map, and I'm going into interconnections of these cities and that name, Mr. Bergt. Now, if there were a motive to sabotage this plane, or a series of motives, what would they be? One would be to cut the cheapy air flights and reduce the costs of trying to compete. The major airlines were losing money. Pan Am, TWA, Western Airlines are all losing money. And stop the man who has cut the low prices in the fares, cut them off and punish them for the price war. The other way is for the CIA to get control of passenger lists, to get a monopoly of airlines, and to interfere with Air Florida, who may not be cooperating with them. The other motive would be to knock out specific passengers at the same time, such as Dorothy Hunt. On the plane crash, there were about 20 other controversial people on Flight 533 that Sherman Skolnick has documented, in addition to Dorothy Hunt, when that plane went down. Who would have the technology to put this plane down? Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple were good at espionage. They were selling Gaddafi the means by which to blow up or stop airplanes. They were linked. Edwin Wilson was the paymaster at the time of Bay of Pigs and worked with E. Howard Hunt and the entire CIA operation and Navy intelligence for years. It would take somebody high up in the intelligence community with the technology and know how to do this. And it would take somebody who I believe is linked and was linked to Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, and those characters that I've been talking about for the past 2 years on this broadcast. We'll take a 1-minute break now, and I'll come back and maybe get your pencil and write down these names so you remember them. It's going to get complicated.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Okay, I hope you got your pencil and paper. The Los Angeles Times had a story January 30th. This is 17 days after the Air Florida crash. CAB, the Civil Aeronautics Board, Friday approved Air Florida's plan to take over Los Angeles-based Western Airlines. So draw a little arrow from Florida out to Los Angeles. They were trying to buy control. Air Florida had first 20% of Western and then 40%, and they want 100% of Western Airline that lost $69 million last year and hasn't given a dividend since 1980, so it must be some jewel. So Air Florida wants Western Airline. They fly Minneapolis and Alaska and Canada and that route, and they wanted to control that. And they were given permission to take control of that by the Civil Aeronautics Board. But this Mr. Berg, Neil Berg, B-E-R-G-T, didn't like that. He's chairman of Western Airlines. He's their chief executive. And he assumed reins. He came to Western Airline in October and said, I want to be your director. And in December, he took over Western Airline, and he planned to buy an airline in Alaska called Wien Air, W-I-E-N, with some money he procured, $50 million cash, then put that down as payment for Western, and he wanted a hurried-up hearing giving him control of Western, but Air Florida won the competition against Mr. Berg. That is the first point, that there was this competition to take Western Airlines, and that this particular person, who's the chairman of the board since December, wanted control of it himself. His name is Neil G. Berg. Now, I don't know how many of you watched 2020, a week ago Thursday. Pierre Salinger was on talking about my favorite characters, Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple. The subject was Arms Sale Exposed, a 2020 exclusive. In spite of a U.S. ban on sale of military hardware to Colonel Gaddafi, 2020 has discovered that Libya has purchased 3 huge Hercules transport. How did they get them? Pierre Salinger will tell you the tale. Well, Pierre Salinger was on telling you the route of how Gaddafi got airplanes. There had been embargo in Marietta, Georgia, against Gaddafi buying these airplanes, these huge transports, but he got them anyway. He got 3 of the C-130 Hercules, and this embargo had been on 8 years. He got 2 of them, C-130s, through the Philippine government, who in turn worked through a Geneva-based businessman identified as Ali Hijazi. And Hijazi is the head of intelligence for Gaddafi in Libya. The third plane came from Alaska International Airways, which a subscriber to these tapes and a long follower of World Watchers was the first to call my attention to it, was that the Alaska International Airway that supplied illegally the Gaddafi airplane, the Hercules transport, was the man who then became chairman of Western Airlines and wants the control of Western Airlines. So he had this Hercules 130, and through an office in Miami, again, where Wilson and Turple worked, it went to Gaddafi, and it came out of Alaska Airlines. The arms sale exposed. The program on the 2020, the ABC News, tells about Alaska International Airlines in 1979, how they put their planes for sale through Miami. The plane went from Alaska to Miami, was supposed to go to Malta, and went to Gaddafi. Now, there can't be any claimed innocence about this because the planes that went to the Philippines by way of the Swiss dummy front was nothing but an office with a door and a telephone, and the same man that worked, the arms merchants that worked in the operation through the Miami with Gaddafi were also linked to the Philippine Swiss operations, which the Wilson Turple gang that sent the special forces people to fly the airplanes for Gaddafi. So the CIA was always supplying Gaddafi, and they came from this same airline in Alaska, the Alaska International Airline. Well, who is Neil Berg and what's his background? Last Sunday, there was a large article in the San Jose Mercury and also in the Los Angeles Times. And Neil Berg, the chief of Western, called them in October of 1981. He found out, this is the man who's one of his transports was down with Gaddafi. He found out that Air Florida wanted Western Airlines. And in October, he went to Seattle and said, I'm ready to become your next executive. By December, 3 months later, he became chairman and chief executive of Western Airlines. $52 million they had lost just the first quarter, but he wanted to come in and take over. He had worked with Alaskan Airlines and had that company. Then he flew to London, where he hired a London broker and bought a fleet of the Lockheed Hercules, which in turn then were dispersed. Now, so many people go to London. Samuel Cummings of the CIA is there, Edwin Wilson safe houses, the Nugan hand money for the CIA, heroin connections for Wilson and Churchill, the headquarters are in London. Training of Carlos the terrorist. It's interesting that this mysterious Neil Berg goes to London to a broker house to get money for the fleet. So we don't know who he saw in London. According to these news articles, he was linked to the CIA. They accused him of working for the Central Intelligence Agency, and he denied he did. He said Southern Air Transport is CIA, and he's envious of their contracts, but he's never short of money, and he was in charge of Alaska International, this company, and he took some mysterious trips. He got special favors from the CIA. One person that worked for him had made some threatening comments about somebody that they wanted to shoot down, so-and-so. That man was arrested, and he went to the highest echelons of government and got him out of jail. And he said, I didn't use normal procedures. He got favors and got this person. There was some threat. I don't know whether these are authentic assassination teams or figure of speech, but you don't go to jail for figures of speech very often with these multimillionaire financiers behind you. In 1974, the Alaska International was posting their profits. Then he creates a holding company called the Alaska International Industries. Now, Edwin Wilson had about 127 dummy fronts, so it's hard with this story just breaking to know where he connects or how. The one thing they have in common was the airplane to Gaddafi, the huge illegal airplane to Gaddafi that these men were trying to get, Wilson and Churchill were trying to get for Gaddafi. But he had Alaska International, then he created Alaska International Industries, which is construction, trucking, and other projects. Other projects in the multi-million-dollar field, you can almost be sure with unknown money from London to buy these huge planes. He has what you call other projects. He's 100% sole owner, such as Howard Hughes or Daniel Ludwig or David Murdoch or these huge new multi-millionaire espionage operators. There's a whole slew of them that seem to be surfacing recently. In 1981, in June, when Air Florida wanted to get interested in Western Airlines, then he got interested in Western Airlines, and by December was the head of Western Airlines when Air Florida showed the interest in buying it. George Batchelor of Air Florida began buying stock in Western Airlines and wanted to build up a fleet. In the meantime, Mr. Berg purchased Wien, W-I-E-N, Air Alaska. Now, he came up with $50 million cash through a newly created corporation. No mention of what the corporation is at all or where he got the money, except of his possible links to the CIA. And he formed, it says, the Eagle International Corporation, another front, and Household International. He had a meeting, and in 4 hours after Household International, he had this Wien airline. He bought Wien Air Alaska, and he was, according to one story, he was going to use that, as I say, to purchase Western. But it was only when Air Florida wanted Western Airline that the man from Alaska who had the airline, who was a multinational traveler, sending airplanes to Pakistan, Botswana, he was all over the world, like World Vision. You name it, he had flights and cargo things going all over to these very controversial countries. And after 1980, he went on a trip about June 1980. He took a yacht with the highly powerful communication systems to keep up with his business, and he allegedly took this trip around the world and came back with a lot of money. I'm very concerned because in 1979, the end of 1979, when the Nugan Bank had folded, they were left with $55 million to $1 billion in CIA money linked to Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple and Theodore Shackley and the CIA that was combined with Air America, heroin traffic, and powerful espionage and assassination teams that were doing military coups around the world, destabilizing Australia, and funds coming from London and interchange between Australia. Now, somewhere that money has never been accounted for. William Colby, director of the CIA, was the attorney for Frank Nugan, and there's been a hush about that bank, but it will surface like the Michael Sindona one of these days. As I say, this man was accused of, or mentioned, being with the CIA. He had international interests. The bulk of his money came from cargo handling jobs after he went to London. So the man who stepped into Western Airlines when he found out that Air Florida wanted it has connections all over the world to major countries, lots of money in London. One airplane that went down to Libya to Gaddafi by way of Miami, which, again, the London-Miami bases that he hits are the bases of Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple. Interior Airways up in Alaska became the Alaska Airlines. He moved into Interior and renamed it Alaska International, went traveling and made a subsidiary into the Alaska International Industries, took 1 year leave, went back and wanted to purchase Western, put his $50 million on Wayne Air Alaska, and worked with Eagle International and Household International, whatever the hell they are. I mean, there's all kinds of dumbly fronts and questions about his work. According to Langhorne Motley, U.S. Ambassador to Brazil, he said Berg flew cargoes to Bangladesh, Pakistan, Botswana, and other remote areas. You better believe. Can you imagine what other remote areas they were? Well, the Los Angeles Times has a large article on this, and it was copied in the San Jose Mercury. Another story, Western Airlines' new chairman charges after profitability but has setbacks. And this was 1 week before the decision of CAB to give Air Florida that favor. This is the Neil Burke of Western Airlines, who is trying to take control of the Western. He just moved in there in December, and it mentions again his Alaskan Airlines, the one that doesn't make the connection of supplying that plane to Gaddafi, but it goes into his problems. He thought he'd be cleared. He hurried the clearance so that he could beat Air Florida to the purchase of Western, but it was held up because they had some questions about his past, and they considered actions against him because when he wanted to buy Western, he didn't give full information about his interlocking directorships when he took the job at Western in December. You better believe he didn't give them information. It's like William Casey of the CIA not telling who his clients were and still won't disclose all of them, which countries he represents, and he's the director of the CIA, or Richard Allen of the National Security Council, not telling about his island, the Sanibel Island condominium with Fred Fielding of the White House, and Fred Fielding, the attorney for the First Lady and her husband, not telling about sharing condominiums with the National Security Advisor. They held up the hearings on Mr. Burke. They wondered about some of the background, why he didn't come through. He claimed he was financially successful because he had rescued Interior Airways from bankruptcy. But the point is, he comes into Western Airline as a very polished, fine man from the business world. Well, there's no trick to run to London and pick up millions of dollars, or Australia to take a trip around the world, or South Africa or Botswana or wherever. The guy has unlimited money and unidentifiable corporations and all kinds of names here that have to have more defining. So is he a successful businessman, or is he like Frank Nugan and Michael Hand, who go from Southeast Asia, where they never had a bank before in their life, and open up a bank with $1 million and then $1 billion of CIA money and narcotics traffic linked to Richard Allen and Robert Vesco and these assassination teams? You take two clugs and put them in an office, and you tell them they're brilliant, and the office runs itself for a lot of operations for the Defense Department. I'm sure that Mr. Burke is plenty bright. He's 45 years old. the first thing he did when he came into Western Airlines in December was to clean out all the middle jobs, 500 middle managers, and eliminate the dozen top executives. Now, this is a CIA operation to take over the route of Western Airline. It may not be economic to fire these people, but it may be to bring in all of your own people so you have control of the route. Air Florida had a juicy route. If we're going into a war in Central America where the control of the massive narcotics coming in the United States is coming in through Florida, they were going down to Costa Rica and Venezuela and Honduras and London and the Bahamas, and it would be very nice to compete if there were a possible motive, say, for wanting Air Florida down, and these people worked with those other people who are expertise at sabotaging airplanes. It'd be very nice to give them so economic problems and lawsuits that you break their back and you force them to go along with you. Now, Mr. Burt is meeting with the president of Air Florida in 2 weeks to decide what to do because he wanted control of Western and the Civil Aeronautics gave it to Air Florida. So they're going to have to meet head-on in 2 weeks to decide what to do. Another story, the Western Airlines needed money, and Mr. Burke put up this bid. Civil Aeronautics gave it to Air Florida. But there was an article in the Washington Post and the New York Times. Western wins an extension. A group of banks and insurance companies have extended $19 million more into a loan for Western Airlines without any collateral before from unsecured debts of $90 million. They put up collateral now of 29 aircraft, and they have 90 days to come up with money to pay back the loans. They're very much in debt, the Western Airlines. They have $27 million left and 100 out of their $120 million line of credit. They have to come up with a lot of money, and as I say, they lost $69 million in 1981. So why are they both fighting for Western Airlines? I believe that the control of this country or the taking of America has several steps. They'll go through the process of, say, the last 40 years since World War II. One of the corporations that controls going in and out of airports is Wackenhut Corporation. They X-ray your baggage, the luggage, and do all the searches. They let everyone be examined except the hijackers who bring in these ridiculous guns and cause these hijackings, such as the Air Florida last week. A man wanted to go back to Cuba for a Cuba Libre and then came back home. They get through the gate. You notice there's no problem. Why the desire to take over Western that's so much in debt? Wackenhut controls who gets on and off of the airports, and the controlling of the passenger list of who's on the list, who's off, is very important to the CIA and the Defense Department if you are going into a police state. It's like the mix-up of the two passengers on the World Airways in Boston that hasn't been resolved, or seeing a body in the water and the Coast Guard coming up and saying, well, if he's not on the list, we won't bring the body up. And they still haven't found the bodies, the two that sunk at that time that plane went down. Maybe someday they'll come back to shore with holes in them. You know, there have been suicides that the coroner has described, and they've exhumed bodies and found bullet holes in their back. Why didn't they bring those men up? And on the Air Florida, there was one man flying under another man's name. It's very good for the intelligence community to control the airlines, and I think that if a man like this wants to control Western Airlines, or any of them want to control, any person wants to control the airlines in this country, we should really know where their money came from. Did they really work to compete with the American capitalistic system, or does the CIA just give them $55 million and say, here, buy this airline, with that use collateral and buy another, because we don't want Air Florida? They're just too spunky and they're making too much money and they're putting us to shame. So, hey, you come on in and be director of this company. The man who was the director of Air Florida was so successful, went to Pan Am that was failing, and as soon as they want to extend and get Western in a fair market to compete, then this guy comes down from Alaska and wants to take over Air Florida. This story gets very complicated because of his role of the plane going to Miami and then to Libya, and also his stepping into this company, this losing company at the time that Air Florida wanted it, and trying to hurry through the hearings. The article in the Wall Street Journal, Air Florida prompts further cuts in fares to Florida locations. That was January 25th. That was just days after the accident. The accident was on the 13th. Air Florida sparked the latest round of fare reductions on Friday. It slashed its fares between Florida, the Northeast, and Midwest cities. The daily fare cuts, when they were announced, caused Eastern Airline and Delta to meet them. Soon Pan Am said, we can't be undercut by World Airways, and they shaved off $2 off their fare, even though they're losing money. The Wall Street Journal said Air Florida started the warfare by noting it made a similar reduction last year at the same time. Air Florida, Eastern, Delta, TWA reduced fares were effective immediately through February the 9th and on northbound flights from February the 13th. So Pan Am had to say right away, we'll reduce it to $77. So Air Florida is definitely giving them trouble. Now, these other people that are competing with them have lines in London, in Miami, in Libya. They have associations with the very people who have the technology to give Air Florida a lot of problems. They had the competitive edge on them that they didn't want them to come and move into Western. So the evidence is clear to me. There's enough evidence on those tape recorders. Plus, one article that I have at home that I didn't bring in was the possibility that some of the tape, believe it or not, was erased from the flight recorder. But you get from what has been printed so far that within 2 seconds they knew there was trouble. Within 12 seconds they were positive. There were noises that weren't right. They were ordered to go anyway. They hardly got off the ground, then they crashed into the bridge, just right down into the bridge, and there was no reason for them. The ice had been checked. They had looked at the windows and so forth. And the main stories now of the Air Florida are out of the newspaper. Melvin Belli has taken the responsibility of carrying suits against Air Florida. Again, a man from Los Angeles who's worked with the CIA and with the intelligence system as a lawyer all his life, has offered to help break the back of Air Florida. Now, they do have enough insurance money to cover most of this. I understand that they're pretty well covered for the insurance, so they're financially in a very enviable and secure place. But if insurance cases go on and indefinitely, it's bound to hurt them. But the Civil Aeronautics weren't so concerned about that crash that they didn't go ahead and give them the approval. So now it is the president of Western Airline, and as you see the articles of the fight between Air Florida and Western for control of it, because Air Florida has been given it, remember that this man only came in October. He flew from Alaska to Seattle to the Western representative and said, I'll come in and take charge. He then became the director in December. He has undisclosed businesses or dummy fronts. The sources of his money are not told. And I wonder about the yacht trip that he took in 1980, if he did stop in Australia, and where he traveled. It began in South Africa, that particular trip. Where did he get the money? Why did he step in? And if there is an air war, will other planes be safe, or will people be on Air Florida when they have other crashes? If they're that vulnerable, what comes next? Now, to wind up the program this evening, after the Air Florida, I have another article in the newspaper this week that is close to my heart and about summarizes what I've tried to say about agent provocateurs. And next week I want to do some on Dozier and the I promised to do that this week, but I wanted to wind up the Florida, the bulk of it this evening. We'll go into the General Dozier fiasco, that ridiculous kidnapping. Incidentally, the three most notorious pictures of the week is in the newspaper. One of Mubarak hugging and kissing Alexander Haig. The other is Dozier with his fingers over his ears having to listen to rock music. He hasn't a thing critical to say about the brigades who kept him in the tent for 6 weeks, except that awful rock music. And the other is Nancy adorning New China for the assassin Mubarak. They have to have the finest to eat off, nothing but the best for the killers. Okay, this is from the Washington Post. Kidnapping suspects seized in El Salvador. This is January 29th, down in El Salvador. There was a kidnapping down there of a very wealthy person. A former major was arrested in regards of kidnapping Mr. Bustamante, a member of El Salvador's wealthiest family. The major who was arrested was caught picking up $4 million in a ransom for the kidnap. The former major was arrested in connection with the kidnapping of a wealthy landowner who this major headed death squads with about 400 members, and they're accused in El Salvador of killing thousands of people. Another one of the articles says that he was the head of the death squad. The chief of police, the head of the death squad, kidnapped a member of one of the wealthiest families, and they put out a request for $4 million that they demanded. And this article in the Washington Post says many things will come out during the investigation, among them kidnappings and assassinations. We believe he had control of 400 men who acted as death squads, a high official said. The police said Roeder organized groups of armed men to give protection to local and foreign businesses. So he has government links to the paramilitary and the rightist group. So what was he doing? He was kidnapping one of these wealthy people in El Salvador for the purpose of blaming those terrible terrorists. It's like the SLA is the CIA and the FBI kidnapping Patty Hearst to make it look like the radical movement in California was behind that. And, I wrote a book-length article, the SLA is the CIA. Well, El Salvador has this notorious death squad where they train foreign police to go out and shoot, similar to the death squads in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, those notorious death squads that the Nazi government and the CIA set up to terrorize and repress and to kill labor leaders, journalists, and so forth. So what business does he have kidnapping one of the wealthiest people there? Because then the newspaper can say how bad the terrorists were. All the papers in El Salvador can throw out, isn't this a terrible thing that these radicals have kidnapped this person? Then you take $4 million that's put in a slot for this chief of police, and he can take that money and recycle it into weapons. With $4 million, you can buy quite a few machine guns from South America and from the United States and from the mercenaries, so that the United States can say categorically, we are not sending troops, we're only assisting. We're not even saying that anymore. We're saying we're going to send troops. I understand from somebody I talked to today that some soldiers from Fort Ord were sent down to El Salvador this week, or just ready to leave for El Salvador. It's like Laos and Cambodia. We have troops there, but there's another article in the paper this week. Should the United States have a foreign legion? In other words, if Congress won't pass a bill that we can have a war against El Salvador, we'll send a foreign legion, which is trained CIA killers, and we won't have to even ask Congress for the money. You take the $4 million out of one till that the landowners have down in El Salvador, and you put in the hands of the policemen and the death squad. And it was just a fluke that this guy was picked up kidnapping a prominent family, member of a prominent family down there, one of the wealthiest families in El Salvador. The person was kidnapped for 2 weeks and then was freed, and they described it as a special forces operation. And did you see, the other picture I liked this week was George Bush with the SWAT teams and the special forces in Washington, D.C. after that pet rock hit his car. But the provocateur angle has never been properly exposed, at what lengths the far right kidnaps, blows up trains, blows up planes, sabotages it to make it appear that the left has done it. This has come out over and over again in the case of Carlos the terrorist, trained by the CIA, and even a guy like Jack Anderson writes about the CIA protection of Carlos, how he can kill people all over the world or help kill the Jewish athletes in Munich or bomb airplanes and throw up bombs in Europe, trained with weapons from Mitchell Werbel from Georgia, from Samuel Cummings from Pennsylvania to London, where he moved, with offices in Monte Carlo. They train these people and give them the weapons, and then the news and the editorials all come out about terrorism. We get constant articles about the terrorism, but not the fact of who is behind them. And when there are articles linking the Red Brigades to the far right, to the Nazi connections, to the narcotic connections, which I'll try and do next week on the Dozier case and update those, to the international Nazi organizations, when we get those, we get one single one. For every article that makes that kind of an allegation, there's 300 saying the terrorists come from Russia. Well, our time is up this week. It's another hour gone. You do your homework and study, save articles on Western Airline, Air Florida, and other items of interest, and I'll be back with you next week. This is Mae Brussell, and have a good week.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.
KLRB, Carmel by the Sea.